Hello, I'm Clancy. I'm Managing Editor of Engaged Investor and Pensions Insight magazines. I'm here today with Duncan Howorth, Chief Executive of Jardine Lloyd Thompson's Employee Benefits Group. We're here today to talk about auto-enrolment, what trustees can do to prepare for the new regime and ensure the best pension saving outcomes for their members. Duncan, welcome.
Good morning.
The success of auto-enrolment will largely depend on members having confidence in the schemes into which they're investing. What can trustees do to maximise the chances of this happening?
Well, I think like most projects, the first aspect is to determine what success looks like and develop a project plan towards those aims. At JLT, to help our clients, we've developed a 5-point plan for auto-enrolment. Those 5 points are, first of all, some financial modelling. Secondly, to look at the strategy of complying with auto-enrolment. The third is to discuss and determine the qualifying scheme that will be used for auto-enrolment. The fourth moves on to look at implementation and operational issues. And then the final step is communication with the members. I mean, auto-enrolment as a subject, the biggest impact is obviously on the sponsoring employer. It's the legislation that falls to them, and obviously the cost of extended pension provision is a material one for many UK employers. But it's important that trustees engage very early on with employers, because they will particularly need to be heavily engaged around the implementation and the operational process element, and of course member communication. The work we've done with clients so far has highlighted that actually some of the operational aspects of auto-enrolment are bigger than people anticipate. The whole issue of processing who is eligible to auto-enrolment, how the link between HR systems and pension systems is going to work. And then of course, trustees will need to start work early on in thinking about how they're going to communicate with their members, particularly as so many will be entering the pension savings system for the very first time.
You mentioned operational difficulties there. Do you think payroll systems are prepared for the onset of auto-enrolment?
A good question, Luke. Data often hangs in different places in many organisations. It can sit in HR systems, it can sit in payroll systems, it sits in pension systems. And again, sort of working with some of the larger companies that are going to face auto-enrolment in the early staging dates, we've already identified some quite material issues with understanding where data is going to come from, where it's going to be housed, where auto-enrolment eligibility criteria is going to be kind of processed. Ultimately, the data has to sit in pension systems, so it's important that trustees engage with their pension system providers or pensions administration providers as early as possible. Most of the data is going to have to come, however, from the company, so we are going to need to look to payroll providers to understand to what extent they're going to step in and provide some functionality in order for us to understand, the degree to which auto-enrolment is going to affect the workforce month by month as organisations go through their financial years.
In terms of member education, Duncan, what can trustees do to ensure members understand and consider investment risk?
It's quite a balancing act, I think. On the one hand, there's clearly a need, in our view, to improve the level of engagement that members have with their savings in their schemes. We know that 90% of members in DC schemes at the moment their money sits in these default funds. And I don't expect that to change materially. What I think we need to work at is to have a much higher proportion of those members being active defaulters. What do I mean by active defaulters? I mean that they have made a conscious decision to utilise the default fund, accepting that they're perhaps not in a position to make proactive judgments about which funds their money should go into. But that in doing so, they understand the type of risk that their money is being placed in when it goes into those default funds. I think the second thing the industry needs to do is it needs to step up the default fund solutions. Too often these are not well governed, very passive in terms of the review of their performance, very passive often in terms of actually how the money is being managed. And I think whilst we can move from lifestyling to target date funds and things like that, to me we need to recognise the individuality of members much more in the construction of default funds, and perhaps that means that we'll end up with perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 default funds at work in pension schemes rather than just one.
You touched on governance there. There is a trend to set up governance boards for contract-based schemes. How should these be structured to ensure the best outcomes for members?
I think there's 2 key issues around governance for DC schemes. The first is that often there are DC sections within an overall trust that still has significant DB assets and liabilities at play. And it's often quite difficult for the DC section or the DC issues to be given enough attention by trustees, given the ongoing issues that defined benefit liabilities and the management thereof creates. So where that type of structure exists, I think the creation and perhaps of a DC committee that can focus specifically on some of the issues and the governance of either the DC members or the DC investments would be desirable, so that DC gets the right level of attention. That's the first point. I think the second is we know that the pensions regulator is keen to see a level playing field between contract-based DC and trust-based DC. We know that, I think it's fair to say that governance works better in a trust-based environment at the moment, and therefore the onus is on companies running effectively group personal pensions to introduce governance committees which won't have the same fiduciary duty but should have a similar level of governance responsibility to the scheme and to the DC assets that are being invested on behalf of all the members.
Do you think it would be helpful for government to legislate to improve governance at contract-based schemes?
No. I think that what we have at the moment is a good legislative and a good regulatory framework set both by government and by the pensions regulator, and it should be possible for companies, trustees and advisors to work together within those principles in order to develop some best practice. Another area of concern of the pensions regulator is one around small schemes. Now, no one's saying that small schemes are run badly, but there's a sense of whether the same level of resources can be applied to governance of smaller schemes rather than larger schemes. So I think the industry needs to be able to respond and say, how can we introduce and operate effective governance for some of the smaller schemes that do a very good job for mid-sized employers in the country.
It's been insightful. Thank you very much, Duncan.
Thank you.
That was an interview with Duncan Howorth, Chief Executive of Jardine Lloyd Thompson's Employee Benefits Group. I hope you agree it was a most insightful conversation and one which will help trustees going forward in fulfilling their obligations. I'm Clancy, this is Pensions TV. Thanks for watching.